Hello, we're back. Story time, my friends. The epic adventure continues of Mrs. Frisby and the Rats of NIMH. And we continue on with the Air Ducts. We're going to find out what happens to Nicodemus, Justin, Jenner, all these super smart rats, and how or if they, well, obviously they're going to escape from the lab, we know that, but how they're going to do it. We're going to hear more about that tale starting right now. The Air Ducts. And so it was. By teaching us how to read, they had taught us how to get away. Justin climbed easily up the open door of his cage and vanished over the top with a flick of his tail. He came back an hour later, greatly excited and full of information. Yet it was typical of Justin that, even as excited as he was, he stayed calm. He thought clearly. He climbed down the front of my cage rather than his own and spoke softly. We both assumed that by now the other rats were asleep. "Nicodemus, come on out. I'll show you how." He directed me, and as I reached through the wire bars of the door and felt beneath it, I found the small metal knob, slid it forward and sideward and felt the door swing loose against my shoulder. I followed him up the side of the cage to the shelf above. There we stopped. It was the first time I had met Justin, face to face. He said, "It's better talking here than around that partition." "Yes." "Did you get down?" "Yes." "How did you get back up?" "At the end of this shelf there's a big cabinet. They keep the mouse cages in it. It has wire mesh doors. You can climb up and down them like a ladder." "Of course," I said. "I remember now. I had seen that cabinet many times when my cage was carried past it. For some reason, perhaps because they were smaller, the mice were kept in cages within a cage." Justin said, "Nicodemus, I found the way out. I think I found the way to get out." "You have? How?" "At the end of the room, there's an opening in the baseboard at the bottom of the wall. Air blows in through one of them and out the other. Each one has a metal grid covering it, and on the grid there's a sign that says, 'Lift to adjust airflow.' I lifted one of them. It hangs on hinges like a trap door. Behind it there is a thing like a metal window. When you slide it wide open, more air blows in. But the main thing is, it's easily big enough to walk through and get out." "But what's on the other one? Where does it lead?" "On the other side there's a duct, a thing like a square metal pipe built right into the wall. I walked along it, not very far, but I can figure out where it must go. There's bound to be a duct like it, leading to every room in the building, and they must all branch off one main central pipe, and that one has to lead somewhere to the outside. But that's where our air comes from. That's why they never open the windows. I don't think those windows can open." He was right, of course. The building had central air conditioning. What we had to do was find the main air shaft and explore it. There would have to be an intake at one end and an outlet at the other. But that was easier said than done, and before it was done there were questions to be answered. What about the rest of the rats? There were 20 of us in the laboratory, and we had to let the others know. So, one by one, we woke them and showed them how to open their cages. It was an odd assembly that gathered that night, under the dimmed lights in the echoing laboratory, on the shelf where Justin and I had talked. We all knew each other, in a way, from the passing of messages over the preceding months. Yet, except for Jenner and me, none of us had ever really met. We were strangers, though, as you can imagine. It did not take long for us to develop a feeling of comradeship, for we 20 were alone in a strange world. Just how alone and how strange, none of us really understood at first. Yet in a way, we sensed it from the beginning. The group looked to me as leader, probably because it was Justin and I who first set them free, and because Justin was obviously younger than I. We did not attempt to leave that night, but went together and looked at the metal grid Justin had discovered, and made plans for exploring the air ducts. Jenner was astute at that sort of thing. He could foresee problems. Whoopsies. Didn't mean to have that on. Sorry about that. With a vent like this leading to every room, he said, it will be easy to get lost. When we explore, we're going to need some way of finding our way back here. Why should we come back? Someone asked. Because it may take more than one night to find the way out. If it does, whoever's doing the exploring must be back in his cage by morning. Otherwise, Dr. Schultz will find out. Jenner was right. It took us about a week. What we did, after some more discussion, was to find some equipment. First, a large spool of thread in one of the cabinets where some of us had seen Julie place it one day. Second, a screwdriver that was kept on a shelf near the electric equipment, because, as Jenner pointed out, there would probably be a screen over the end of the air shaft to keep out debris, and we might have to pry it loose. What we really needed was a light, for the ducts at night were completely dark. But there was none to be had, not even a box of matches. The thread and the screwdriver we hid in the duct, a few feet from the entrance. We could only hope they would not be missed, or that if they were, we wouldn't be suspected. Justin and two others were chosen as the exploration party. One of the others was Arthur, whom you've met. They had a terrible time at first. Here was a maze to end all mazes, and in the dark they quickly lost their sense of direction. Still they kept at it, night after night, exploring the shafts that laced like a cubical spiderweb through the walls and ceilings of the building. Here's a picture of them exploring. Exploration party. They would tie the end of their thread to the grid in our laboratory and unroll it from the spool as they went. Very clever. You catch that? So in order for them to find their way back, because I was just thinking, gosh, they could get lost there all night, and then in the morning they haven't found their way back. The thread, they keep the spool of thread in the lab, and then they tie it around their waist, and they can find their way back. Very cool. I think, sometimes cave divers or people like that who have to explore in the dark, they do a similar thing, because you lose total sense of direction without it. They would tie the end of the thread to the grid in our they're explaining this now. They would tie the end of their thread to the grid in our laboratory and unroll it from the spool as they went. Time and time again, they reached the end of the thread and had to come back. It just isn't long enough, Justin would complain. Every time I come to the end, I think, if I could just go 10 feet further. And finally, that's what we did. On the 7th night, just as the thread ran out, he and the other two reached a shaft that was wider than any they had found before, and it seemed as they walked along it to be slanting gently upward, but the spool was empty. You wait here, Justin said to the others. I'm going just a little way farther. Hang on to the spool, and if I call back. They had tied the end of the thread around the spool so that they would not lose it in the dark. Justin had a hunch. The air coming through the shaft had a fresher smell where they were, and it seemed to be blowing harder than in the other shafts. Up ahead he thought he could hear a whir of a machine running quietly, and there was a faint vibration in the metal under his feet. He went on. The shaft turned upward at a sharp angle, and then straight ahead he saw it, a patch of lighter-colored darkness than the pitch black around him, and in the middle of it 3 stars twinkling. It was the open sky. Across the opening there was, as Jenner had predicted, a coarse screen of heavy wire. He ran towards it for a few seconds longer, and then stopped. The sound of the machine had grown suddenly louder, changing from a whir to a roar. It had obviously shifted speed. An automatic switch somewhere in the building had turned it from low to high, and the air blowing just past Justin came on so hard it made him gasp. He braced his feet against the metal and held on. In a minute, as suddenly as it had roared, the machine returned to a whisper. He looked around and realized he was lucky to have stopped. By the dim light from the sky, he could see that he had reached a point where perhaps 24 air shafts came together like branches into the trunk of a tree. If he had gone a few steps farther, he would never have been able to distinguish which shaft was his. He turned in his tracks, and in a few minutes he rejoined his friends. We had a meeting that night,
and Justin told all of us what he had found. He had left the thread, anchored by the screwdriver, to guide us out. Some were for leaving immediately, but it was late, and Jenner and I had argued against it. We did not know how long it would take us to break through the screen at the end. If it should take us more than an hour or two, daylight would be upon us. We would be unable to risk returning to the laboratory and would have to spend the day in the shaft or try to get away by broad daylight. Dr. Schultz might even figure out how we had gone and trap us in the air shaft. Finally, reluctantly, everyone agreed to spend one more day in the laboratory and leave early the next night. But it was a hard decision, with freedom so near and everyone thinking as I did. Suppose Dr. Schultz grew suspicious and put locks on our cages. Suppose someone found our thread and pulled it out. This was unlikely. The near end, tied to the spool, was 6 feet up the shaft, well hidden. Just the same, we were uneasy. Then, just as we were ending our meeting, a new complication arose. We had been standing in a rough circle on the floor of the laboratory, just outside the 2 screen doors that enclosed the mice cages. Now, from inside, came a voice.
Nicodemus.
It was a clear but plaintive call, the voice of a mouse. We had almost forgotten the mice were there, and I was startled to hear one of them knew my name. We all grew quiet. "Who's calling me?" I asked.
"My name is Jonathan," said the voice. "We've been listening to your talk about going out. We would like to go too, but we cannot open our cages."
As you can imagine, this caused a certain consternation, coming at the last minute. None of us knew much about the mice, except what we had heard Dr. Schultz dictate into his tape recorder. From that we had learned only that they had been getting the same injections that we were getting, and that the treatment had worked about as well on them as on us. They were sort of a side experiment, without a control group. Justin was studying the cabinet.
"Why not?" he said. "If we can get the doors to open." Someone muttered, "They'll slow us down." "No," said the mouse Jonathan. "We will not. Only open our cages when you go, and we will make our own way. We won't even stay with you, if you prefer."
"How many are you?" I asked.
"Only 8, and the cabinet doors are easy to open. There's just a simple hook, halfway up."
But Justin and Arthur had already figured that out. They climbed up the screen, unhooked the hook, and the doors swung open.
"The cage is open the same way as yours," said another mouse, "but we can't reach far enough to unlatch them."
"All right," I said. "Tomorrow night, as soon as Dr. Schultz and the others leave, we'll open your cages, and you can follow the thread with us to get out. After that, you're on your own."
"Agreed," said Jonathan, "and thank you."
"And now," I said, "we should all get back to the cages. Justin, please hook the doors again." I had latched myself into my cage and was getting ready for sleep when I heard a scratching noise on the door, and there was Jenner, climbing down from above.
"Nicodemus," he said, "can I come in?"
"Of course, but it's getting on toward morning."
"I won't stay long." He unlatched the door and entered. "There's something we've got to decide."
"I know," I said. "I've been thinking about it too."
"When do we get out, and where are we going to go?"
I could not see Jenner's face in the dark of the cage, but I knew from his voice that he was worrying. I said, "At first I thought, home, of course. But then, when I began remembering, I realized that won't work. We could find the way, I suppose, now that we can read, but if we did, what then? We wouldn't find anyone we know."
"And yet," Jenner said, "you know that's not the real point."
"No."
"The real point is this. We don't know where to go because we don't know what we are. Do you want to go back to living in a sewer pipe and eating other people's garbage? Because that's what rats do. But the fact is, we aren't rats anymore. We're something Dr. Schultz has made. Something new. Dr. Schultz says our intelligence has increased more than 1,000%. I suspect he's underestimated. I think we're probably as intelligent as he is, maybe more. We can read with a little practice. We're able to write, too. I mean, to do both. I think we can learn to do anything we want. But where do we do it? Where does a group of civilized rats fit in? Kind of an interesting question. And this is page 137, kind of like really dawning on them what has happened.
I don't know, I said. We're going to have to find out. It won't be easy, but even so, the first step must be to get out of here. We're lucky to have a chance, but it won't last. We're a jump ahead of Dr. Schultz. If he knew what we know, he wouldn't leave us alone in here another night, and he's sure to find out soon.
Another thing to worry about, Jenner said. If we do get away, when he finds we're gone, won't he figure out how we did it? And won't he realize that we must have learned to read?
Probably.
And then what? What will happen when he announces that there's a group of civilized rats roaming loose? Rats that can read and think and figure things out.
I said, let's wait until we're free before we worry about that. But Jenna was right. It was a thing to worry about. Maybe it still is. The next day was terrible. The next day was terrible. I kept expecting to hear Dr. Schultz say, "Who took my screwdriver?" And then to hear Julie add, "My thread is missing too." That could have happened and sent them to thinking, but it didn't. And that night, an hour after Julie, George, and Dr. Schultz left the laboratory, we were out of our cages and gathered, the whole group of us, before the mouse cabinet. Justin opened its doors, unlatched their cages, and the mice came out. They looked very small and frightened, but one stood bravely forward.
"You are Nicodemus?" he said
To me,
"I'm Jonathan. Thank you for taking us out with you."
"We're not out yet," I said, "but you're welcome." We had no time for chatting. The light coming in the windows was turning gray. In less than an hour it would be dark, and we would need light to figure out how to open the screen at the end of the shaft.
So it's the evening, right? So doctors go home at normal end of work time, so there's still this gap when the sun is going down before dinner time. Trying to operate in that dusk sort of time.
We went to the opening in the baseboard. "Justin," I said, "take the lead. Roll up the thread as you go. I'll bring up in the rear. No noise. There's sure to be somebody awake somewhere in the building. We don't want them to hear us." I did not want to leave the thread where it might be found. The more I thought about it, the more I felt sure Dr. Schultz would try to track us down, for quite a few reasons. Justin lifted the grid, pushing open the sliding panel, and one by one we went through. As I watched the others go ahead of me, I noticed for the first time that one of the mice was white. Then I went in myself, closing the grid behind me and pushing the panel half shut again, its normal position. With Justin leading the way, we moved through the dark passage quickly and easily. In only 15 or 20 minutes we had reached the end of the thread. Then, as Justin told us it would, the shaft widened. We could hear the whir of the machine ahead, and almost immediately we saw a square of gray daylight. We had reached the end of the shaft, and there a terrible thing happened. Justin, you will recall, had told us that the machine, the pump that pulled the air through the shaft, had switched from low speed to high when he had first explored through there. So we were forewarned. The trouble was, the forewarning was no use at all, not so far as the mice were concerned. We were approaching the lighted square of the opening when the roar began. The blast of air came like a sudden whistling gale. It took my breath and flattened my ears against my head, and I closed my eyes instinctively. I was still in the rear, and when I opened my eyes again, I saw one of the mice sliding past me, clawing uselessly with his small nails at the smooth metal beneath him. Another followed him, and still another, and one by one they were blown backward into the dark maze of tunnels we had just left. Very sad turn of events here. I braced myself in the corner of the shaft and grabbed at one as he slid by. It was the white mouse. I caught him by one leg. That must be the photo I just showed you, the picture. It was yes. Pulled him around behind me and held on. There you have it. Another blue face on into the rat ahead of me and stopped there. It was Jonathan, who had been near the lead. But the rest were lost. 6 in all. They were simply too light. They were blown away. They blew away like dead leaves, and we never saw them again. In another minute, the roar stopped. The rush of air slowed from a gale to a breeze, and we were able to go forward again. I said to the white mouse, "You'd better hold on to me. That might happen again." He looked at me in dismay.
"But what about the others? 6 are lost. I've got to go back and look for them."
Jonathan quickly joined him. "I'll go with you." "No," I said. "That would be useless and foolish. You have no idea which shaft they were blown into, nor even if they went the same way, if they all went the same way. And if you should find them, how would you find your way out again? And suppose the wind comes again? Then there would be 8 lost instead of 6. The wind did come again, 6 times more, while we worked with the screwdriver to pry open the screen. Each time we had to stop work and hang on. The 2 mice clung to the screen itself. Some of us braced ourselves behind them in case they should slip. And Justin, taking the thread with him as the guideline, went back to search for the other 6. He explored shaft after shaft to the end of the spool, calling softly as he went, but it was futile. To this day, we don't know what became of those 6 mice. They may have found their way out eventually, or they may have died in there. We left an opening in the screen for them, just in case. The screen. It was heavy wire, with holes about the size of an acorn, and it was set in a steel frame. We pried and hammered at it with the screwdriver, but we could not move it. It was fastened on the outside. We couldn't see how. Finally, the white mouse had an idea.
"Push the screwdriver through the wire near the bottom," he said, "and pry up."
We did, and the wire bent a fraction of an inch. We did it again, prying down to then left, then right. The hole in the wire grew slowly bigger, until the white mouse said,
"I think that's enough."
He climbed to the small opening, and by squirming and twisting, he got through. Jonathan followed him. They both fell out of sight. But in a minute, Jonathan's head came back in view on the outside.
"It's a sliding bolt," he said. "We're working on it."
Inside, we could hear the faint rasping as the 2 mice tugged on the bolt handle, working it back. Then the crack at the base of the screen widened. We pushed it open, and we were standing on the roof of NIMH, free.
That's the end of the chapter. Juicy chapter right there. A harrowing escape conducted by the mice and the rats. Really sad we lost those mice, though. That's a bummer. What do you think happened to them? Any theories? There was a couple of good turning point sort of quotes and moments in that chapter where Jenna really talks about the implications of like what these tests are all about, the implications of what would the scientists do if they realized the mice had escaped. Are they going to tell somebody? Are they going to not? It seems like they probably didn't tell anybody because probably that type of remarkable news would have traveled as far as whatever farm they got to and stuff like that. But we'll see. Maybe the rats, who clearly seem to think, at least themselves, they're as intelligent as humans, maybe they found a way to get further away. I didn't read ahead. It's been years since I watched the movie that originally turned me on to this story. So let's see where our author, Robert C. O'Brien, takes us. Thanks so much for joining me on another chapter here and for your patience as I got these out to you. Would love to hear your feedback in the comments. Spread the word to the others who are reading the book or other books here that I've done on the channel. And I hope to see you on the next one.